Writes, regarding Jews, Nazis, communists, Zionists, Masons, would you hazard undertaking the sorting out of fact and fiction in this arena at all? And BPI provided a link to a page that was claiming that Hitler was, in fact, was trying to get rid of the Rothschilds from Germany. Which I think is a complete and utter load of baloney, not only because Hitler was a Rothschild, the son of Alois Hitler, who was himself the illegitimate child of Maria Anna Schicklgruber, who happened to be a servant girl who got pregnant whilst working at the mansion of Baron Rothschild. Oh, an illegitimate son of a servant girl of Baron Rothschild, and his son ends up becoming Hitler. Yeah, funny how that works, isn't it? Hitler and the Nazis were 100% completely and utterly set up and made it into what they were by the international banking community and the international crony capitalists, including those in America. 100% documentable and on the record. You can look at all of the various connections, and they're deep and multiplicitous. So I'll include some links into some of what I'm about to just go over in passing here, because there is extremely important, and I think I'll have to put this together into a more coherent presentation at some point. But for example, you have the so-called Young Plan, which was enacted in 1930. It was part of the wrangling over German reparations and how are they going to pay, and they're failing in their payments. So how do we get this going? So the Young Plan was enacted. It was named after the president of General Electric at the time, who went by the name of Young. It was also funded into existence with the help of J.P. Morgan. And this Young Plan was enacted in 1930, just as the international banking system was collapsing. Germany went into its Weimar hyperinflationary struggle. So they had to give it a year off of reparation payments. It ended up repudiating the reparations and never going back. The Young Plan was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back during that period. So General Electric and J.P. Morgan helped to set up the downfall of the German banking system, which it led to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. And I think we know that connection. But interestingly enough, one of the interesting aspects of that is that one of the bodies that was set up as the facilitator of the Young Plan was the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, in Basel, Switzerland, the central bank of the central bankers. And this is the body that, for example, was specifically identified by Carroll Quigley in Tragedy and Hope as the arm, the body, the institution through which the powers of international capital had a far-reaching aim, nothing less than the consolidation of total global control over the financial order. Or I can't remember the exact quote off the top of my head, but that famous quote about the powers of international capital having a far-reaching aim, directly talking about the Bank for International Settlements that was enacted as a result of this Young Plan. You can also look to Carroll Quigley who talks about how the Milner Group specifically was looking, which was one of the agents, the bodies that were created through the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes back in the late part of the 19th century to create the global secret society structure. And the Milner Group talked about how they had to get Germany and Russia fighting for each other, fighting for control over Eastern Europe so they could more effectively divide and conquer them. So they openly talked about having to set up, and this was years and years before Hitler even arrived on the scene. They were talking about how they'd have to build up a tyrant and set him up to fail in Germany. And that's, lo and behold, exactly what ended up happening. So throughout the 1930s, after the collapse of the banking system, the Weimar hyperinflation cycle, the rise of the Nazis, there's this myth that the neo-Nazis put out there that, Germany turned it around by turning to National Socialism, and they cleaned up their banking and they kicked out the Rothschilds, and suddenly they had a vibrant economy, which again is total bunk. Their economy was 100% supported by Wall Street and the Wall Street cronies, including Standard Oil in cooperation with IG Farben, which created the synthetic oil without which the German military literally could not have functioned. You have Ford, you have General Electric, you have DuPont, all of those companies in there with their production facilities, with the American loans and funding flowing into them, IBM and the Hollerith machines, all of those connections 100% firmly embedded in Germany. And then, as Anthony Sutton has talked about, and again, you have to read Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler for all of the deep connections that he uncovered, but including, of course, things like the plants and factories of these American corporations in Germany were specifically not bombed during the saturation bombing of Germany. So you had, for example, the General Electric plants, one of them completely unscathed. Several of the others had minor shrapnel damage and windows blown out and the like from bombing going on around them. Or the Ford plant in Cologne, the largest Ford plant in the country, and one that the Allies specifically knew was creating machinery and weaponry for the German Wehrmacht, specifically avoided by the Allied bombers. So again, we know that American industry and finance was helping the German war machine the entire time. There was the connections that lasted all the way up through the 1940s. We know, for example, the Bush family, Bush Harriman, the banking brothers were helping to fund Hitler through the back door, and that's been, we've talked about that in previous editions of the Corbett Report. There's a very, very, very big picture that I'm attempting to at least paint the broad outlines of here, that Hitler was 100% supported by the banking oligarchy, 100% supported by the financiers and the capitalists from America, and absolutely set up to be the tyrannical dictator that they could fight against that would cause, well, everything that World War II caused, including, of course, the aftermath and the creation of the United Nations, which came out of the CFR study group that was funded by the Rockefellers. I mean, there's so many connections here that even beginning to say this in a general way is so much. So I'll include, I don't know, as many links as possible in the show notes so you can follow the threads of the story I'm saying. And as I say, I'll have to put this together into a coherent presentation at some point. But the idea that Hitler was fighting against the Rothschilds and was really against the banking oligarchy is neo-Nazi propaganda, completely, utterly fake. And this should not, of course, be interpreted as an apologia in any way for Hitler or the Nazis. Of course it isn't. Just because he was a stooge and a puppet of the globalists who ended up getting double-crossed, by the way. He allowed the Dunkirk evacuation, of course, for example, which he could have completely wiped out the British army and Britain would have been his for the taking. He let them go because he had a secret deal in the back door with the British aristocracy, who we know were all secretly Nazis. This is why Rudolf Hess, his deputy, flew into Scotland, ended up getting taken prisoner and held the rest of his life in a prison, or at least supposedly it was him. Again, there's questions about that. But why did they hold him in prison 30 years after the end of World War II? Because Hitler was double-crossed. He thought they had a deal. Hess flew in with the documents saying, hey, well, we've got the deal. What's going on? They ended up imprisoning him. That's when Hitler knew he was in deep doo-doo because he was getting double-crossed. He has to enact Operation Barbarossa because he knows Stalin's going to open up the Eastern Front because he's getting double-crossed there. And that's why the biggest miscalculation in military history, Operation Barbarossa, that's why it took place. So again, so much to go through with this question, but suffice it to say, no, I don't think that Hitler was really against the banking oligarchy. He was a product of it, and to what extent he was a willing dupe, a knowing dupe, whatever the case is, the neo-Nazi propaganda about this is totally off base. Let's move on to Brian, who writes, just curious